Besides being an EDiscovery attorney focused on document review and analytics, I'm also a poet. So in document review, it's all about telling the story, being able to go in, see where things are, and to be able to develop the right map, the right framework for the data at issue. So I learned very early on that turning around an aircraft carrier is not easy. The offshore team was doing one thing, the onshore team was doing another, and then they were correcting each other. It was a question of scale. Well, how do I do for 1 million documents what I historically have done for 10,000? You could create a notification list of 400,000 people, but in your export, if one line is off, you have sent the wrong information to 399,999 people. And that happens. AI is going to be an exoskeleton, or it's going to be a jetpack. It's going to make whatever you do better. It is not a bot that's going to take you and replace you. I don't think it gets there. I don't think human beings will allow that.
This is The Litigator's Edge, the podcast where smart strategy, practical innovation, and real-world experience come together to move litigation forward. Each week, we sit down with attorneys, legal tech leaders, and trusted advisors who are rethinking how great legal work gets done. You'll hear how law firms are building a competitive advantage. These conversations are grounded, insightful, and designed to help you refine how you work and how you win. Here is your host, Aniket Sawant.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of The Litigator's Edge, the podcast where innovative attorneys reveal the strategies that have transformed their legal practice. My name is Aniket Sawant, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Threadio. My guest today is a legal strategist who operates at the critical intersection of law and technology, building what he calls the validation layer for AI-driven litigation. He helps Fortune 100 companies navigate the massive data challenges of modern class actions, multi-district litigations, and catastrophic data breaches. Having previously directed a global managed review organization of over 1,500 attorneys across 3 continents, he now leads an elite practice in advanced analytics and e-discovery at one of the nation's premier information law boutiques. It's my pleasure to welcome Vikram Masson to the podcast. Welcome, Vic, and thank you for being here.
Hi, Aniket. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's my pleasure, Vic. As you know, I like to start each conversation like this with either a fun fact or a cringe joke from my guest. Which will it be for you, and what is it?
I will avoid the cringe joke. I don't think I have many of those, but I do have one fun fact. So, and this might seem inconsonant to people, but besides being an EDiscovery attorney focused on document review and analytics, I'm also a poet. I have a number of published poems that you can Google on. If you Google vikrammasson.com poet, you'll see my output. And it might seem inconsonant because, document review is all about data. It's about delivery. It's about the intersection of data with technology. And poetry is very discursive. It's very literary, for lack of a better term. But I think the two are related. Both, at least in my poetry, seek sort of a narrative meaning behind what's being written, right? So in document review, it's all about telling the story, right? And the people who are interested in document review are those, I think, who are also interested in stories, right? How things progress, how they accrete. And it's the same with literature and with poetry, in my view.
That's a great fun fact. Thank you for sharing that. I've heard a lot of them, but I've never heard, I've never had a guest who's also a poet in addition to being an attorney. So thank you for sharing that. One observation as you were saying that is that, one is document review, so the review of ideas or concepts, and the other, I think, which is your fun fact is the generation of ideas or concepts, or their synthesis from your brain. So yeah, I certainly look forward to, looking you up and looking at some of your poems and reading through them. So thank you for sharing that. My next question, Vic, is that I think of every attorney or attorney/poet who makes the time to be on my show as a superhero, and every superhero has an origin story, and I would love to learn yours.
Yeah. So I don't have a cape in my closet, so I don't know if I define myself as a superhero, but I do have an origin story. In EDiscovery, from my generation at least, there is nobody at all who planned this as a career choice, because when we were growing up, it really didn't exist, or it existed in a very nascent format, right? But large information did exist, volume did exist, right? And that has always been a challenge in the law because it's taking that information and distilling it. But really, what happened in the early 2000s, late 90s, probably even more, was because of computers, just this vast proliferation of data, right? So I was really, as a lawyer, doing other things before I got into discovery. I was doing, estate planning. I was doing financial advisory services, which are completely removed from the law. But I had reached a point in my career where I wanted to try something different in the early 2000s. And uh, like is very common today, there was an opportunity in document review for a temporary position. I took it up, right? At the time, really what you had both a combination of paper and, computer-based review, right? So my first projects were taking boxes, looking at information, what the proverbial banker's box, as they're called, where the opposing party had sent us stuff or where we were expected to produce the party, and just reading it manually at a desk, and then providing either a pink sheet if it was responsive or a red sheet if it was privileged. Um, and that was the job, right? And for most people, the first thing that comes to mind is tedious. Wow, this must be really tedious, right? But I like reading, number 1. 2, I like the story, like I said, right? So you begin reading, you have your facts in front of you that are provided by the attorney when you're starting out, right? And you try to connect those facts to the documents at hand, right? And so doing that, and I said, wow, I'm really interested in this. So, even though this podcast is called The Litigator's Edge, really I'm litigator adjacent, right? I consider myself a facilitator, right? Um, the things I like doing best are making connections between people, making connections between ideas, helping people understand things, right? So I said to myself, if I can do this well and make a career out of it, it would sort of capture the types of things, one, I think I'm strong at, and two, that I'd be passionate about, right? So very early on, uh, I did that. I became good at it. I started at a consulting firm that eventually became Deloitte. Um, and as a result of that, I said, yeah, I found my calling. A lot of people at cocktail parties will say, well, that's not very interesting potentially, right? But I was like, no, 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 it's very interesting. Since my personality, I really like it. So that's my origin story.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Vic. So can you maybe walk us through, the specific organizations that you were with, sort of where, maybe starting from your, where this sort of shift happened to to discovery and then to e-discovery, starting from maybe your journey in law school and then your estate planning and some of those other
Yeah.
ventures
So
that you.
I went to law school. I graduated from Brooklyn Law School. I started off as an estate planning attorney, and both at small firms and then for a while by myself, right? And then I eventually transitioned into financial services organizations where I was doing something very similar for them, right? Like helping out with estate analysis, estate planning. Eventually had my own book. And then, after the dot-com bust, right, which would be 99, 2000, a lot of the market for my services had declined, right? And I didn't really have as much of a book, is what they would call it, as others, right? So I said that I could keep doing this. I could probably struggle through it, but I want to try something else, right? And that's how eDiscovery came up. Discovery, then eDiscovery. So I started with a firm called Barrasso Consulting. It was in New Jersey. It was a innovator, a very elite early organization in the space. um, we use technology uh, in a way that is very similar to how things are done today, right? Through various tools at the time. At the time in the market, we had Concordance, which was a popular tool. We still use their load files um, and their format when making productions, for example. Um, there was Introspect, and there were other tools, right, that essentially took the document, processed it, and made it intelligible on a computer screen for attorneys to review, right? So, like I said, I think I sort of started where both were being done, right? Both the manual process and the technology process. And that sort of gave me the understanding of a workflow that ultimately became the dominant workflow in the market. The way you procured attorneys on a contingency basis, right? Using technology both to cull data and to facilitate the document review and then working towards a deadline, right? Then that company was eventually bought by Deloitte. So Deloitte is a major Big Four global organization. And really what I learned there was scale. I learned that you could bring people to a problem, right? And Deloitte had a lot of people, but most importantly, it was the diversity of knowledge behind each person, right? So Deloitte could bring a diverse team of forensics experts, of experts in technology, of lawyers to a single project. And I learned early on that there's a lot of synergistic power in having that kind of a team. And as I proceeded, I said, those are the types of teams I need to build, right? If I don't build a Deloitte scale team, I can build something smaller with the similar synergistic power, right? So spent many years at Deloitte working in a similar capacity, and then was asked to help build their offshore operation, which at the time was in Hyderabad. So that was also very interesting, right? Again, the Big Four was very early in India, developed sophisticated operations, sophisticated delivery structures. So for me, it was really about learning that, learning how you scale, um, and learning how to manage globally, right? Because there's different cultures, different people, different requirements, right? In a global jurisdiction. Although at the end, people are the same. They want to learn things, they want to have vision, they want to know what your vision is, and they're intellectually curious. But still, being able to systematically take that information and apply it to a global team is what I learned there, right? And then at UnitedLex, it was about the vision, right? Because I quickly moved up in the organization. My first position was actually in India, where I helped build a team. I took it from a small group of maybe 25 to 30 attorneys. And in India, they're permanent, all the way up to 450 when I left in 2.5 years. Um, what I learned there is that Indians are extremely motivated if they have direction, um, that document review is a career path. It's not just, a gig along the way, and that there was an opportunity to develop careers for people uh, who, had just finished law school and in some cases had some experience, but not necessarily that much, what we would call freshers, right? Um, and in India, it is all about communicating vision, right? It's about why are we here? Why are we doing it, right? How can I grow, right? So that's number one. And then number two, creating almost like a family structure, almost like a joint family structure, I would say, because there's a lot of um, interpersonal noise that you have to sort of manage and control in a different way than in the US, which is, people just come in, they do their work, and as long as they feel like they're going somewhere, they go. But in India, it's a little bit more, right? So I learned that. And then beyond that, I learned about scale. I learned about profit and loss, about how no matter how good a job you're doing, if you're not making money, there's no point, right? So learning about how to do those things effectively, right? While keeping the client front and center, right? At the end of the day, in professional services, it is all about the clients, right? What they want, what they need, right? And you learn very quickly that if you're satisfying your clients, if you have what you call client satisfaction, and you align your employees to attain that satisfaction, like make it that their goal as well, then you have a harmonious organization. So I learned that there as well. I was at UnitedLex for a long time, until I think 2023, right? And what I saw in the industry is what I think many people saw in many industries at the time. I said to myself that, I built this massive organization, just like other ALSPs, not unique to UnitedLex. But technology, while it had a profound effect up to that point, could really have a disruptive effect at some point in the future, right? So I said to myself, this is probably a good time. I have a mature organization to look elsewhere, right? And my thinking was that if technology is going to play a greater role in both enabling finding information, which is ultimately what our purpose is in discovery, and delivering the right information, um, then I may have to rebuild. I may have to start with a smaller team, right? And my thinking was that in law firms, and especially at a firm like Redgrave, which has always been at the forefront of law and technology, elite reputation, right? That I would have the opportunity and the platform to, number one, build a team from bottom up again, right? More technology enabled, right? So fewer people, but more aptitude in technology, right? And three, because I would be starting a new structure or building a new structure, have the ability to pivot as technology disrupted, the discovery process, right? So I came here, have been building this team. We started with 4 or 5 attorneys. We're now up to 20. We've got 7 or 8 technologists. We had a technologist, Sarah Mahoney, who was sort of leading our technology group for discovery. Um, which really is within relativity and other technology tools, right? So we're managing that process. But then taking people and building a team out of them, saying to them that, okay, we are here, we have an elite reputation, we have elite clients. Our clients are going to be asking us questions about AI, about how we can use it effectively. Let's create an organization that can respond to that, number one, but more importantly, that can lead the change, that can lead the thought leadership in developing a solution, using AI for discovery and for litigation. So that's what I mean by sort of building the validation layer, because my strong belief is that there's going to be a human in the loop, and that's going to be me and my team at the end of the day.
That's great. Thanks so much, Vic, for sharing that narrative or the sweep of your career over the years. I have a few follow-up questions from all of what you just shared. So number one is, when in your career, what point and with which organization were you when you made the switch, or you had this realization that, hey, discovery, you enjoy the manual, or you used to enjoy the manual discovery process, but e-discovery is a real thing. And so when did that shift occur, and how did you realize that shift was occurring, and what did you do to catalyze it?
Probably in 2011 or 2012, right? Maybe just before I joined UnitedLex, or late in Deloitte, I realized that, this is not about human beings reviewing documents as much as I liked doing that, right? It is about information, and it is about the procurement of information. So I realized that technology, and not only technology, right? Because anyone can talk about technology, but the specific workflows that you develop to extract information, from various corporate platforms or wherever you happen to be extracting information from, is as critically important as anything you're going to do downstream in review, right? Because number one, if you don't procure information correctly, you are bound to make errors, right? Those errors could either be you misproducing information that you should have, or you produce too much information, or worse of all, you can't get the information at all and your deadlines pass, and you've got what's called spoliations, issues, sanctions, and potential things of that nature, right? So I learned that it's really not, you have the superhero example. It's not the cape, it's the data room. It's being able to go in, see where things are, and to be able to develop the right map, the right framework for the data at issue, and to be able to develop processes that will facilitate the extraction and the review of that data. So that was, 2010, 2011. I think at the time, we had email, right? But then you had, like I said, exponential growth in data, non-custodial data sources, databases, Oracle, what have you, right? So how are we going to get all this information, this immense information, that may be required in discovery, and do it correctly?
Makes sense. And just for the benefit of our audience, so your through line obviously has been discovery. And so when you were at Deloitte, which is obviously a professional services firm and not a law firm, you were leading the discovery practice there, right? Just
So
to
I
be
was a bit more junior then. I wasn't leading. I was participant. I was a
okay.
manager at one point, right? So yeah, document review is often done by organizations that are not law firms, right? So you may have licensed attorneys like we did at UnitedLex and at Deloitte, right? But the organization, and this is due to various bar rulings, did not necessarily have to be a law firm, right? So alternative legal services providers can ethically provide review services, but the catch is under the supervision of a law firm, right? So for example, if you're Deloitte or you're UnitedLex or Epic or whomever, you can conduct these services, right? But there's got to be oversight from outside counsel, right? Whereas at Redgrave, I am counsel, right? I have the oversight. I am the authority that would oversee potentially UnitedLex or an Epic. So it's a little bit different. The work is very similar, right? You're doing the same sort of things, right? But the ultimate sign off on it, and then of course, testifying on behalf of it is typically done by law firms. Although ALSPs also testify on behalf of data and on documents as I've done in the past.
Makes sense. Thanks for that clarification. So just to paraphrase, sort of your careers moved from being sort of obviously you're a trained attorney, but you were in a professional services firm that was maybe a little bit outside of the law firm orbit, and then you went to UnitedLex, which is obviously an ALSP, which is closer to that orbit. Now you're in a law firm where you are counsel
That's
and you
right.
work.
And most people go the opposite way, right? You start in a law firm, right? And then they eventually decide that, okay, maybe I'm a better fit at an ALSP or a technology company or like at an AI company now. I went the opposite way, which was very interesting, right? Because within a law firm, there's certain structures, there's higher level of conflicts, higher level of ethical screening, that you navigate and you manage, right? So in a law firm, the expectations for separation, for ethical behavior, I think are much higher, right? Not to say that ALSPs or Deloitte are unethical, but it's just a different standard, right? For what is expected of what you can do, and that comes up very clearly in conflicts, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
making sure that you don't have conflicts with other firms and other providers. Yep.
Absolutely. While on the topic of Redgrave, so you've been there for now. It sounds like maybe a couple of years or
Mhm.
just over. What
2.5 years.
Yep. Why was this the law firm that you chose to go to as you were going from your outer orbit of of law to or this document review to being at a law firm? What drew you to them, and what makes them unique in the market?
So as I'd mentioned before, their elite reputation, right? Jonathan Redgrave, who's the name partner, he was very instrumental in developing the Sedona principles, which have been the governing thought leadership in our space. Number two, there are very few firms that focus exclusively on e-discovery. And I personally think, and I'm biased, that Redgrave is the best at it, right? So coming to a place where people understood precisely what I did and precisely what we do as a review and analytics organization was very important, right? And number three, having worked at mega organizations and then medium-sized organizations, I felt that in this transition phase where AI was going to play an increasingly large role, having an organization that was flexible in understanding these things, where you could actually move things, change a workflow, change an approach to things, was the kind of place I wanted to be. And Redgrave fit that bill perfectly, right? Because, number one, it is small, it's not massive, right? Even though we have very impressive client list in a variety of industries. But because of that, and because there's always been a little bit of an entrepreneur's edge here, because of our position at the intersection of law and technology, I felt that I'd be able to try new things, and that has very much been the case.
That's awesome. You mentioned entrepreneurs edge, and I remember when you were saying a couple of minutes ago about how you wanted to build an organization that was at the scale that you had led, UnitedLex and other places. It sounded like that's what you wanted to do. So you had that entrepreneurial or have that entrepreneurial streak within you, and it seemed like a good fit in that regard.
Absolutely. I think I can build a scale. I will not need 1,500 people to do it. I think it'll be much less than that, but I think we can build a great organization here. And the sky is the limit, honestly, right now, because clients are coming to us and asking us, what do we do with this new technology? How do we apply it, right? What does this mean for my matters, right? So we are in a prime position to answer those questions just because of who we are.
Absolutely. We'll come to the latest and greatest in the AI and all of that in just a minute. But I want to go back a little bit in time again and ask for maybe your thoughts around a specific, maybe massive, chaotic, potentially discovery project that had multiple moving parts, that had large teams, maybe even potentially some of those cultural differences or nuances that needed to be managed. Can you maybe at a high level walk us through one such project?
Yeah. So I worked on probably 3 of the 5 largest multi-district litigations in history by product liability litigations, right? And they all have a couple of themes in common, right? So we all have stories of things that don't go well, right? This is my analysis in general. I was on a project that had, and this is in the days, I think, where you probably needed a lot more people than you do now, right? So I had a couple of hundred people in the US. I had maybe 500 people in India working on this project, right? Um, and it was moving, right? It was going really well, right? But then ultimately, as in all projects, there was a lot of change in guidance, right? And this was coming from the client, it was coming from the law firms. It's like we have to sort of change track, right? So I learned very early on that turning around an aircraft carrier is not easy, right? So to get 700 people aligned, and keep in mind, in a matter like this, you're under a lot of pressure to deliver quickly, right? Is not easy. So what I learned was that, you can have guidance and all. You can tell people stuff via email or on a phone call, right? But unless you've got very designed workflows and a very specific chain of command as to who is responsible for what, no matter how hard people are working, you're going to make mistakes and you could potentially fail. So we did not fail on this project, right? But we had a lot of issues where, for example, the offshore team was doing one thing, the onshore team was doing another, and then they were correcting each other, right? So creating a lot of churn, right? So what I did was I said, okay, clear the board, right? And I wrote, this is what I want to happen, right? And I created basically an organization chart, right? I said, you're going to be responsible for this, and you're the last word here. You're going to be responsible for this, and you're the last word here, right? So initially, I'd ruffle some egos because people were sort of operating in their own universe, but I was able to create lateral structure across the organizations, right? Both the US, and we also had, by the way, a UK component doing foreign language review, right? So across the three organizations, creating a workflow and a structure eventually obviated the issues, and we were able to get back on track, right? So this is really a communications issue, communications about how things should be done, right? Substantively on the document. So the way to address that, I think, is best done through that sort of a process, right? The other thing I learned from this project was that when people are underwater, right, the solution is not always more people, right? So being a senior leader, I had the ability to find more people and to just throw it at the problem. In some cases, the best solution was to just sit and listen to how overworked the person was, right? And then to give them ideas for making it less stressful than it was, right? And that may have involved bringing on another person. It may have been as simple as take a day off. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out, right? Watch, nothing's going to happen. You'll come back. It's going to be fine, right? So learning people management under pressure is extremely important, right? And doing that well is not easy because if you alienate people at that time, you're probably putting yourself in jeopardy, right? They're very critical to your success. So I learned very early on that you have to have a soft touch at those moments, right? You can deconstruct what happened later on, right? You can do your root cause analyses and what have you about how a project went. But in the moment, it's about empathy, it's about connecting with people, and it's about finding little solutions that'll make their lives a little bit easier.
That's so interesting, Vic. What's fascinating about what you're sharing is while the end result obviously is effective document review, and that is meant to assist with litigation or being litigation adjacent, as you mentioned, so much of what you described is essentially a management. It's an exercise in effective management, which is not something that I would assume a lot of even attorneys would think about as being key to the success of maybe their matter or whatever it is. And so that's a fascinating.
Well, let me tell you something, Aniket. This is why law firms have not done this successfully for a very long time. It's really the reason the ALSP industry formed, right? It's like lawyers are really good at analyzing issues and coming up with conclusions based on those issues and then advocating zealously for their clients, right? And also analyzing and dissecting information, right? But scale, because when data proliferated and the industry proliferated, it was a question of scale. Well, how do I do for 1 million documents what I historically have done for 10,000, right? So that's where management comes in, right? That's where ALSPs caught their window. Firms like Redgrave, and there's others as well, but bring project management expertise, bring management expertise, including people management expertise to projects, right? So I think fundamentally to do this well, there is a very critical project management component, right? And that project management component needs to have a continuous improvement framework built into it, right? Because every project is different. We're human beings. We make errors on every project, right? So how do we overcome those? How do we capture what we've learned from the past and then apply it to the future? So we make new mistakes, but we don't make the same mistakes, right? So that is a very crucial insight, and that is very true of discovery in general, right? It's both the law and it's management, project management, successful business, running an operation.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's come back to the technology question, right? And technology is the opposite of being static. It's something that evolves. It's obviously evolved a long way. Even the pre-AI years from when you started and actually looking at it as an e-discovery tool, 2011, 2012, as you mentioned, right up to 2022, maybe the decade or so, where the generative AI was not really a thing. So I guess looking back and also looking at where things stand today, what do you say is the biggest, or what are the 2 or 3 biggest transformations that have either been facilitated or precipitated by generative AI, or that have the potential to to do so relative to how things were run maybe even 5 or 6 years ago?
Yeah, good question. So in document review and e-discovery, we had been very AI forward. And by AI, I don't mean LLMs, but I mean machine learning, using support vector machines, logistical regression, various techniques to find documents, right? And then to apply the learnings from a small set of documents outward to more documents, right? So to find responsive documents, which is ultimately the goal. So we had what's called TAR for a very, very long time, right? So we had this machine learning environment that really made us tech forward, right? Because we had to learn how to deploy a technology model to a large set of data, right? So early on, we did this, right? Then AI comes on board, and with AI, the first question that was asked is, well, what is it doing differently, right? From TAR, because TAR would make a prediction about responsiveness. It could also less well make a prediction about privilege, for example, right? And it looked initially like, well, it's doing the same thing, but right now the token costs are so high, it's way more expensive. So why even bother? So very interestingly, after the Chat GPT era sort of began, the initial response, and this is anecdotal, but in my view, the initial response was a surge in tar, right? People were like, well, there's a new technology out there, but let's figure out how to use the old one too and apply that, right? Because surprisingly, when I'd left UnitedLex, there was still a lot of resistance from corporate clients to even use tar. They wanted a manual review by human beings. And they were like, well, we don't really want to get into it or whatever. And I think part of that is because they felt they didn't understand it, right? The initial thought about AI was it's doing the same thing. But then ultimately, the realization came, and this came through a lot of experimentation, that it could offer more, right? So number one, you could get a prediction just like you could with TAR about whether a document was responsive or not, right? But it would also tell you why it thought so, right? So it give you a narrative summary, right, as part of its output, right? So it provided reasoning, right, which is very helpful, right? Because when you're making decisions on large sets of documents, understanding systemic reasoning is very important. That is something you do not get with TAR, right? Number two, it is generative, right? So one of the big onerous requirements in discovery is what's called a privilege log. So the privilege log is a set of privileged documents that you've withheld from production, right? But as a matter of as a matter of law, you have to provide a log of those documents, which includes information about its metadata and then a brief statement about why you consider it privileged to the opposing party, right? And those logs are often challenged or subject to further scrutiny either by courts or by the opposing parties, right? So very early on, one of the easy use cases for AI was let's have it generate this logline description, right? So typically it took armies of attorneys to do this over time, right? We all developed processes that made it more efficient, but here you had generated output, right? And secondly, because a log is usually 1% or 2% or whatever percent, much less than the absolute overall responsive corpus, your token costs are much reduced, right? So you're not spending a lot of money on the output, right? So that became a very early use case. A lot of ALSPs and Relativity itself created tools around it, right? Um, and if you look at adaptability, even the most conservative clients are very open to it because the feeling is it's just generating content. You still have an attorney look at it, right, to make sure that it's right or to correct it, right? And then you've saved yourself the cost of having someone manually go ahead and write descriptions for those things, right? So those two areas, it was very helpful. And with the description, I think what it also fueled was what's called key document identification. So, you mentioned in your notes, like what are the smoking guns? What are the needles in the haystack, right? So using AI, you can potentially get to a set of documents that are more, that are highly responsive for your matter, or could even, potentially obviate the need for the matter at all because you could settle, right? You can find that early on using AI, and you can also find it after discovery when the actual trial work is beginning, right? So key document identification is a big part of, of the work that associates do on trials. That can also be reduced greatly, right? The third use case would be privilege. So I mentioned, ultimately in discovery, not only do you want to produce documents and find the documents most apposite to your litigation, you also want to prevent the opposing side from seeing documents that are privileged, right? In which there's a communication with an attorney, or there's work product which is essentially documents prepared in anticipation of litigation, right? So you don't want the opposing party to see that. Unfortunately, in review, it happens quite a bit, not with my teams, but with many teams, right? Where documents are released, right? And then you have to claw them back, right? But you can't unsee what you see, right? So there has been some development in AI that helps you identify privileged documents. I don't think it's fully there yet. There's a lot of nuances to privilege and to human interactions that it doesn't get. It tends to be more conservative than not, right? Which necessitates the need still, I think, for very good privileged reviewers who can look at a document and say, is this privileged? Will this pass muster in a court or in a challenge, right? So those are some areas where it's helpful.
What you mentioned about an early use case being the list of the log list, of, as it were, of privileged documents. That seems to me like a perfect use case for those early AI models, right? Because they may not have been capable of the nuanced legal analysis, etc., that you would need further on in litigation, or even for maybe creating summaries of the documents that you have. But they can certainly identify documents in a list and put those out, save the team a ton of time. So
that is exactly right. And you're generating content, right? And at the end of the day, like I said, I mentioned about humans in the loop, you still have an attorney look at the output, right? So, but rather than crafting it, which takes a lot of hours, and then looking at it, now you just have to look at it. So maybe you have to edit it, right? Because no tool is perfect. You're going to have to edit some, right? But your starting point is much, much more efficient. You've cut out a good chunk of hours, and that's a win, I think, for both clients and for us, frankly, because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of onerous work. Yeah.
I presume a lot of onerous work that doesn't necessarily show itself in terms of it's just a list, but the list obviously takes a long time to generate. So
yeah, and there's an art to the description. You want to describe enough that the opposing party or the judge is going to say, okay, I understand why they retained a privilege on this document, but not too much that you're giving it away, right? Then, okay, well, I know what the underlying document is about now, right? So there's a little bit of an art to it, right? In terms of how you write the description. And AI is a lot of tools are adjustable, like their output, right? So it's a matter of tweaking it, right? Tweaking the interface and then tweaking your output and coming up with a good solution and something defensible ultimately, because it's about defensibility at the end, right? Is this a defensible description?
makes sense. Switching gears a little, Vic, to another part of what you do, which is you lead incident response and data breach reviews, which is a crisis situation. I would imagine it's different from sort of a long running document review. So can you maybe talk about your work there and how your mindset, the similarities and differences between your mindset when you're dealing with traditional discovery versus a data breach investigation?
Sure. And just full disclosure, I do not do incident response at Redgrave. We do have a privacy offering, but personally, I've not done a project here or supervised one. But I can tell you, having led UnitedLex, that number one, as you would expect, it is onerous, right? Because you've had a breach, right? Number two, uh, the position of the client is under extreme duress, right? So first things first, right? What information has been breached, right? What information do I have to extract from the breach data that would ultimately require notification to a party, right? So, for example, if your social security number wound up in a hack, right? How do I find that number, right? How do I associate it with you? And then how do I make sure that you know about it, right? Because there's disclosure obligations in each state and jurisdictional requirements where I have to get that information to you, right? So EDiscovery was almost accidental. It was because EDiscovery is about taking a large chunk of data and finding information about it that incident response sort of evolved from this, right? So a couple of things about it. Number one, it does not have the procedural rigor of discovery where you have to produce every document, right? You have to produce it in a certain format, acceptable to the opposing side. Here you have to do nothing of the sort. Ultimately, what you're trying to do in a data breach response is prepare a notification list, right? To tell people like you that you've been breached, right? And then to eventually set the stage for any subsequent litigation, right? If it's going to happen, right? So, for example, you would only need to process one version of a document, whereas in discovery, you couldn't get away with doing that, right? One version only because you only need to find that social security number once, right? Or that tax ID number once, right? So early on, we used tools that were appropriate to discovery, like Nuix, for example, to process data, right? and then relativity to review the data, right? And when I left, it was still very much about using very large teams, especially in India, right, to actually go through documents, find the information so that we could ultimately extract it and create the notification list, right? So it was very interesting, very onerous. I think AI brings a lot of ability to find information more quickly, um, to find sources of data, right? Uh, to govern that data in such a way that, like I said, you're only extracting information once because uh, you don't want duplicates, right? And then finally, to format that data in such a way that the information is going to the right people. I will give you an example, right? You could create a notification list of 400,000 people, right? But in your export, if one line is off, you have sent the wrong information to 399,999 people. And that happens, right?
Oh no.
And your clients will come back to me and say, why do I have Aniket's notification when it should have gone to Vikram, right? Got to redo the whole process, right? So I think it is more onerous. Um, it is about what has happened, right? It is not retrospective. It is less rigorous than discovery, but the client the client level of stress is much higher, right? So again, empathetic personalities, uh, people who can calmly look at data and situations are the best people to lead these projects, right? And then when it comes to the actual review, attention to details. And when it comes to AI, who can come up with the best workflow, right? Because it's not about just having the technology. We all have the technology on our desktops, right? It's about how do you create a workflow that's going to get you from A to where you need to be. That is where the differentiation, I think, comes in. It's in the workflow.
That makes a lot of sense, because ultimately, whether it's AI or whether it's a human resource, and obviously, as you mentioned, you use a combination of both, and you have the human in the loop. In either case, going back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, you have to communicate what it is that resource, whether human or otherwise, has to do, and what role they play in the overall chain of of whatever that workflow might be. So that's a fascinating insight.
It is, and it only becomes more important, right? That skill set, that ability to segregate and explain will become even more important as agentic workflows are introduced into discovery, right? And we're starting to see that. There's organizations offering it, um, within platforms as standalones. I'm working with several confidential startups who are trying to do this as well, right? But how do you create agents that can follow directions in the same manner, and just as importantly, to pivot when there's a change, right? So you don't have catastrophic incorrect results as the result of a wrong pivot, right? So it's going to be very interesting. I think those skill sets become more important. I think having humans in the loop become even more important as AI evolves into the industry.
Well, Vic, this has been a fascinating conversation. Just a few questions to wrap us up here. So, one is, you had briefly alluded to this earlier in our conversation, which is that you're involved in the Sedona conference. For our listeners who may not know what that is, what is it, and what's your role in it, and what do you see as the value that brings to?
Yeah, so Sedona, I have historically been involved in it. I've stepped back a little bit recently, but it is arguably the premier thought leadership forum for discovery in the United States, and it also has an international footprint and a Canadian footprint, right? So Sedona is not law, right? But it is authoritative guidance that helps set the standard in the law, right? So Sedona develops principles. Those principles are disseminated into the legal community. And then the sign of victory is when judges start citing it as a principle that is reasonable, defensible, and proportional, right? Because those are going to be always your key interests in the law, right? No matter what you do, no matter how much work you put in, that reasonableness test and the proportionality, is this the right work for this job, front and center, right? So, I worked on it. I worked on a number of drafting teams. When I was doing it last around data privacy in civil litigation, with one of my colleagues here, Martin Tully at Redgrave, who's leading a drafting team, and I've been on any number of drafting panels and brainstorming committees. Redgrave is at the forefront of Sedona as well. Like we have a partner, Ray Mangum, who's currently leading the AI definitions subgroup of Sedona, right? So I regularly communicate with him, work with him. So while I'd step back a little bit, Redgrave has a very active role in the organization, and in thought leadership in general. Because as I noted, we would like to be setting the standards, not just reacting to what's happening.
Makes sense. If if I'm an early career attorney and I'm looking at sort of potentially a career similar to that which you've had, which is in discovery or e-discovery, and or if I'm looking at AI and all its capabilities with some level of trepidation, for lack of a better term, what advice would you have for someone?
So, I have children. I have an older daughter. She goes to NYU. And, I don't know if you know this about Generation Z, but there's a large view in Generation Z that AI is bad. It's not a good thing, right? You saw the boos that were recently received at a commencement address, right? And she's like, oh, what will I do, right? And, she is considering going to law school. So what I tell her is, look, at the end of the day, um, this is my view. This is not necessarily the view of anyone else, but my view is that AI is going to be an exoskeleton or it's going to be a jetpack. It's going to make whatever you do better, right? It is not a bot that's going to take you and replace you, right? I don't think it gets there, right? I don't think human beings will allow that. I don't think it's necessary. I think a lot will proliferate around AI and make human beings more productive. So I tell her the best thing you can do is learn how to use what's out there, right? So she likes marketing. I say, use Claude Code and ask Claude to help you develop a marketing plan or develop output for what you do, right? So my advice to lawyers and to younger people is to learn how to use these things. This is the language of the future, right? People who are on the verge of law school or in college, like my daughter, saw both worlds, right? If you're a little bit younger, this is the only world you're going to know, right? But you're actually in a unique position where you have both vantage points, right? And I tell them, if you don't know how to use it, then you're probably at more of a disadvantage than if you do know how to use it, right? Because at the end of the day, whatever skills you have, you can amplify those using technology. And that's been the case in discovery, I think, in general, right? We're not seeing a diminishment, even among the LSPs necessarily in people. Some roles may diminish, like the first pass reviewer. But in every other era, we've seen other jobs created as a result of lost jobs, as a consequence of new technology. So that is my viewpoint. I think it is unwise to say you're going to replace everyone. That is very bad PR. Unfortunately, a lot of AI leaders do that. Not a good thing, but I don't feel that way at all.
Thank you for that, Vic. Final question for you. Is there a question that I should have asked you, but I didn't?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered everything.
Awesome.
Pretty much.
Thank you for that. Well, Vic, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm sure we could have gone into even further depth on any of the topics that we touched upon, but I think this was very illuminating for me, and I'm sure our audience will learn a lot as well. So thank you once again, Vic, and I appreciate it.
The Litigator's Edge podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.